in Monroe, Virginia, saying, Steve, you're way behind time. This is not 38, it's old 97. Put her into Spencer on time. He looked around and said to his black greasy fireman, shovel in a little more coal. When we cross that White Oak Mountain, watch old 97.
What role did the railroads play in the history of Caldwell County? My name is John Hawkins, and I'm director of the Caldwell Heritage Museum. With me today is Matt Bumgarner, a railroad historian, who is going to be giving us a little bit of information into what the railroads were like, how they came into being, why they were necessary, and the role that they played through the years. Welcome, Matt.
Thank you very much for having me today.
Okay, Matt, we're here in the museum, and we're in the section that I've called the County Progresses, because it was the section of time immediately after the Civil War, the Reconstruction era, if you want to call it that. And even though there were a lot of bad things going on, it seems like there were some good things going on in Caldwell County too. One of the things that we're talking about, since we're talking about transportation, I think we've got to talk a little bit about the turnpike. The Lenore Blowing Rock Turnpike. It helped open up Blowing Rock and probably was a key link in railroading a little bit later on. But maybe you want to tell us just a little bit about the railroads in the Reconstruction era, even though they were not in Caldwell County at that time.
Okay. Well, to understand the ultimate history, like you say, you really have to start even before the beginning. And what was Reconstruction? Reconstruction was the era immediately after the Civil War, and if there was anything, there was only hope. At least the conflict had stopped. There was very little money to be had. There was very little industry. As a lot of your followers are aware of, Caldwell County suffered immensely at the end of the war. Right. So the future they could look forward to. The turnpike, as you mentioned, played a pivotal role. I think the county's nickname, the Gateway to the Blue Ridge, even started in these days. And it really was a channel to feed into the Piedmont from the mountains. The roads, of course, were nothing more than dirt and mud half the year. And you only had your closest railroad was in Hickory, 20 miles away. And that was the unfinished, as of the time, North Carolina Railroad, which only went as far as Morganton. It was a standard gauge railroad at the time, but everything had to go through the mountains, down the rough roads, to the railroad, and then to the rest of the country.
Of course, in Hickory, he says 20 miles away, roughly 20 minutes today by car, but probably a half a day's ride in those days. And if you had a wagon loaded with goods, it would have taken you probably even longer. But there were some far-sighted people in the county, it seems, and railroads were going to be one of the other things. There's several things actually that had begun to happen. I think we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about the fire department beginning in 1877, showing that, again, the people were progressive. And but of course, since our main focus today is the railroad, let's talk about it. I believe the seeds were laid probably as early as, about 1874?
Actually, a little bit earlier than that, yes. As early as 1869. In addition to the politics, the economics at the time also spurred a new technology, and that was called narrow gauge railroads. Against the poor economy, the theory behind a narrow gauge railroad was it was smaller. A standard gauge railroad is 4 feet, 8.5 inches. A narrow gauge railroad is only 3 feet wide.
That's between rails.
That's right. Now, someone might think, well, that's a lot smaller, and it is a bit smaller. And the theory was the equipment's less, the construction costs are less, therefore you can put a smaller railroad where a larger one can't go for less cost. Now, that doesn't mean it's an inferior technology. If you think of Tweetsie Railroad just up the road, that's a narrow gauge railroad. It's still a substantial piece of machinery. So it was against this backdrop, people were very excited about it because they could have a railroad built into the area for less money. And against that backdrop, the Carolina narrow gauge And then the Chester and Lenoir narrow gauge were proposed, and they were to go from Chester, South Carolina, up through Gastonia, Maiden, Newton, Hickory, and Lenoir, and of course the projections were ultimately across the mountains into Tennessee.
That never quite happened, though, I don't believe.
Never quite happened, and that's, we can get into the nickname of the railroad, the Can't and Never Will, a little bit later.
All right. Okay, but I just recently read some newspaper articles about that 1874 groundbreaking. It was a big day, apparently, in Caldwell County when grounds were broken. The town leaders seemed to be very much involved in it. G.W.F. Harper, I believe, was one of the leading people. But the thing that interested me so much, Matt, was that at the groundbreaking, well, two or three things actually jump out to me as interesting. The ground was broken by James Harper, who was in his 70s at that time. In fact, he died just a few years later. And he, for his age, and of course, I guess his respect in the town and the fact that he had been a contributor to the growth of the town, he was allowed to shovel the first shovel of dirt at the groundbreaking. But he had 5 ministers who helped him. 2 Presbyterian and 3 Methodist ministers, I believe, were the people who helped him. And I was reminded of what Bob Hope quipped when Sidney Poitier won the Oscar for Lilies of the Field. Said, with all those nuns on his side, how could he lose? So with all these clergymen on their side, how could this railroad not make a go?
That's right. And it's a good thing they had that clergy, because it took the patience of Job to get it here.
Okay, so another good biblical reference there.
Absolutely.
All right. But then the other thing that after those people, those clergymen, and I don't know whether any of the other men of the town had any part in the groundbreaking or not, but there was a lady who got involved, Mrs. Erdle, who happened to be the wife of a minister also. Her husband was the rector at the Episcopal Church here in Lenoir. He's known for his art collection and other things, but Mrs. Erdle jumped in. I got the feeling she kind of pushed her way in maybe and decided that she wanted to be a part of the groundbreaking too. And then it was followed by some of the young ladies from here at Davenport College, from St. Euphemus School, from the Kirkwood School, and then some of the boys from the Finley High School. So the young people got involved. I can't think of a modern counterpart that would create as much excitement as that railroad groundbreaking. Can you?
No, I can't. And the editor of the newspaper, right, and the reporter, W.W. Scott, at the time even said that the railroad building in Caldwell County was everybody's hobby.
Okay.
So it went from the very oldest to the very youngest and of all sexes.
A long steel rail, a short cross tie. I'm on my way back home. I'm on a train, the king of them all, the streamlined cannonball. She moves along like a cannonball.
Okay, even though the groundbreaking was in 1874, I believe it was 1884 before the first train arrived. That's 10 years. In fact, slightly more than 10 years, I think 10 years and a few months. What took so long?
Well, unfortunately, politics and money. What had happened, we mentioned the Chester Lenoir narrow gauge, the Carolina narrow gauge. In 1873, the two efforts were combined into the Chester Lenoir narrow gauge. The problem was in York County, South Carolina, the Board of County Commissioners subscribed to railroad bonds. A group of York County citizens did not like that whatsoever. They didn't think that the county could do that. So they took the railroad to court, and they took the county commissioners to court. It went all the way to the Supreme Court of both Carolinas, and it took 5 years to decide that, yes, the county commissioners could buy bonds, whether or not the majority of the population wanted it. So 5 years right off the bat was wasted in court time and bureaucracy.
So that gets us up to the end of the 1870s.
That's right.
Okay, what happened then once that court case was settled?
Then you actually had to build the 120-mile railroad.
Okay.
And so it took until 1882 before the railroad actually even reached Dallas. And then it finally made it up through Maiden, and they ran out of money.
Okay.
At that time, you wasted another year as Lenoir still wants a railroad. It's got no money. So they first try to sell the railroad, the Chester-Lenoir narrow gauge. They try to get the Western North Carolina Railroad to build basically a 20-mile spur from Hickory to Lenoir. All of that to no avail. The railroad is finally leased to a larger railroad called the Charlotte, Columbia, and Augusta. They finally extended the railroad to Hickory. There was some opposition in Hickory that did not want the railroad coming through Newton and even to Lenoir. And even the probably William Roby, who was the president of the Davenport Women's College here, gave a very influential speech and just absolutely scalded Hickory and its leaders for not letting the railroad come through. Finally, it came through. It passed in early 1884 in the spring. The first train rolled into town.
Okay, Mr. Roby was one of those clergymen who helped break ground that day too.
Yes.
So he did carry he put his money where his mouth was then, didn't he? Or put his mouth to good use, may be a better
Absolutely.
word to convince the people. Right, good. All right, then in 1884 it came to town, I believe.
Absolutely. The first train rolled into town in the spring of '84, but the actual railroad celebration with the gold spike ceremony, if you will, did not happen until June 5th, 1884.
Right, if I understand correctly, the first train was a freight train.
That's correct. It's actually the construction train.
The construction train, okay.
Yes.
Well, somebody's got to be first.
That's absolutely.
And so the first one, and then I believe I have read that around the first, maybe the 4th of June, seemed like was the exact
June
date.
5th.
June 5th. Oh, I wasn't but one day off.
That's right.
That the first passenger train came into town, and the first passenger was John Bernhardt coming home from Davidson College. Is that right?
Right. And Columbus Weathers was one of the train men.
Right.
And it's your magnificent photo collection documents a lot of these early days with the Golden Spike ceremony and some of those dignitaries.
Right. Okay, Columbus Weathers is the grandfather of Jim McCarl, who is here in town, and Jim has told me a couple of things about his grandfather being the first. Was he the conductor or the engineer?
He was the engineer, and Horace Beard was the first conductor.
All right, okay, I've got that. Jim's told me that too, but I don't remember it so from time to time. All right, then was it just 2 or 3 days later that another passenger train came into town that had more passengers on it? Did I read that? Or?
Yes, the railroad got into a regular schedule very gradually. And even in the early days, trains would only run every other day.
Right.
And even the passenger trains, even in the winter, would even scale their schedules back even further.
Right. Well, the reason I was asking about that second one, I believe in the information I read that a passenger on the second train was a young lady named Mary Jones Bell, who eventually married Columbus Weathers. And it made me wonder if a romance started while they were on the train. I don't know whether they knew each other prior to that time or not, but of course, she was a young lady from here in town, from one of the families here in town, and she eventually married Mr. Weathers. So, all sorts of little human interest things go in. There's more, to me, that's one of the fascinating things about history, Matt, whether it's railroad history or whatever, is that people made the history.
Absolutely.
And there were people just like you and me.
Absolutely.
Here she comes, look at her roll. There she goes, eating that coal. Watch her fly, look at her sail. Let her by the barball mail. Watch her go.
Matt, one of the reasons that I wanted you to come by today is we've just created this display here. We've actually had these pictures in the museum at various places, but it's the first time they've all been in one location. And I want you to come by to give us some suggestions and maybe some background on some of these pictures. So tell me whatever you know about any of these pictures and maybe what I need to do to enhance this display some.
Okay. We have a very nice display. Before we get into the pictures, I should mention that the Centennial Edition of the Lenore News Topic does give a wonderful thumbnail history of those first early days of the railroad.
Including a lot of other history of Caldwell County as well.
Absolutely. The first picture you have up here, which says the first train in Lenore, is absolutely accurate. This reproduction you have was taken off of a old stereo view, a lot like the old Viewmasters of the 1970s. And this depicts the celebration of the driving of the gold spike. The newspapers at the time say there was a gold spike that was driven as the final spike. Now, the context of it, I don't know if it was gold painted or gold plated, or that was purely symbolic. The editor of the time, W.W. Scott, left that wide open to interpretation. I don't think it was an actual gold spike, but it was certainly the last spike.
Wouldn't that be great if we had that spike?
Oh,
I'd love to have it on display here.
I would love to see something like that be found. But this stereo view shows it. It shows the band, the local mounted infantry. The passenger cars, interestingly enough, for the first 25 years, didn't just run from Chester to Lenore. It actually went all the way to Lancaster. So the railroads, the Chester-Lenore interchanged at Chester with a railroad that will become called the Lancaster and Chester. And the two railroads operated passenger trains jointly, all the way between Lancaster and Lenore.
And a band in that picture, you say?
Absolutely.
Also, we were a musical town back in the 1880s. That's nice to know.
Apparently so, yeah. The history runs deep here.
It surely does, okay.
Another picture that you have up top, all these early pictures are really taken off of the stereo views.
Right.
The little locomotive with an excursion train with the two flat cars. Very, very small equipment, as you can see here. But still, if you look at the bridge, that's a massive undertaking. That was built with the help of convicts from the state penitentiary. The photo below it shows the Catawba River Bridge, which is even more substantial than the wooden trestle above it. I love the outfits and the hats and the dresses that all the people are wearing on there.
That gives you a good insight into fashions, at least in that too. And I want to go back to this one just a minute, Matt. One of the things I like about that is that reflection in the water. To me, that's some photographer was really good. I'm not a photographer and I don't know much about photography, but to me, that's a great picture because of that reflection.
Well, actually, in North Carolina, especially the Reconstruction era, we were very fortunate to have two very gifted photographers who put their work on stereo views. We had Nat Taylor, who was actually briefly based out of Morganton, and you also had a lot of smaller guys, but if you look on eBay and internet, some of their photographs, they are to this area what Matthew Brady was to the Civil War.
Okay, very good. Okay, that's something I didn't know too. So I always learn something when I talk to you. The little Hudson Depot here.
The Hudson Depot, that picture was taken a little bit later. That picture dates out probably from the late 50s after the agency was closed there. It still exists in downtown Hudson, although not in its original location. They've got the beginnings of a wonderful little museum there.
Right, and we need to plug that for them too. That's called the Hudson Town Museum, I believe, and they'd be glad, I'm sure, to have visitors.
Well, they've done a wonderful job. They're off to a great start for what they have.
Absolutely.
Then you have a third column of pictures here. One says Southern Railway. That was a replica. The upper photograph is a replica of the very first locomotive that pulled the first passenger train in the United States. It was called the Best Friend of Charleston. And it pulled, in Charleston at one time, the South Carolina Railroad was the largest railroad in the world at 130 miles. And a few days after the inaugural run, the boiler started hissing. And it annoyed the fireman, who was a former slave, so he fastened down the safety valve. And a few minutes later, the boiler exploded. So after that, the second car, they used to put bales of cotton to protect the passengers from exploding boilers.
Pretty good safety device, isn't it?
Absolutely.
And then
The last photograph, also stereo view, shows the small locomotive, which was number 2 on the turntable here in Lenoir. And basically, this shot where the end of the railroad was would be down near the ice plant.
Okay.
So on the hill just below the museum here is where this shot would have been taken.
Okay, very good then. Let's move on over a little bit, and because we seem like these pictures are almost non-ending. I think we're fortunate to have these many pictures of railroads in one area.
Absolutely, we really are. The first photograph shows the first passenger train. Now, you notice that locomotive compared to the others is much larger. That would be more along the lines of the Tweetsie locomotives that people are familiar with. It's not, even though it is a narrow gauge, is not small equipment by any stretch of the imagination. So you can see, imagine with muddy roads and wagons, why a site like that would just be absolutely marvelous in the town limits.
And I see, Matt, that date is incorrect there. That should be June of 1884 rather than October of 1886.
Right.
So see, my work never ends. There's always
That's
something
right.
has to be done.
That's right. And this is also a photograph. This is probably the most famous photograph in railroad lore of the Chester-Lenoir narrow gauge. This is the group of fellas sitting on the turntable with the close-up.
And there is Mr. Weathers' picture leaning out the window, and Captain Waddell, who's standing in front of the engine. Is he connected with the railroads in any way?
Yes, he helped with the construction and the grading of the line.
Okay, that was a name that I was not familiar with. Yes. Okay, we're fortunate also to have the program of the dedication, which was on June the 5th, I believe, or said it opened on Thursday, June the 5th. And it looks like they had a fairly nice celebration, doesn't it?
Well, supposedly 5,000 people were in attendance.
Oh, really?
So that was what the local paper said. So they must have really come out of the woodwork in 1884
Absolutely.
to have 5,000. But it's interesting how you have the chief marshal is General Leaventhorpe. And you have a band, the railroad officials, citizens in carriages, citizens on foot, citizens on horseback. And then you have several addresses, and the driving of the last spike, the locomotive whistling, and the ringing of the bells.
Okay, so apparently they had a celebration, and it said the procession formed at 9 o'clock, and then there was a stockholders meeting at 12 o'clock, so it must have been nearly a 3-hour celebration.
It was a day long. There was a barbecue afterwards.
Okay, so there were other things that went on too.
Yes.
It must have been a big day then in the life of Caldwell County.
Well, again, I refer back to the newspaper editor who gave the best contemporary accounts, and he said June 5th, 1884 will be a day that Lenoir remembers forever.
From the great Atlantic Ocean to the wide Pacific shore, from the Queen of Florin Mountains to the South Belle by the Moor, she's mighty tall and handsome and known quite well by all. She's the combination on the Wabash Cannonball.
Once the railroad got here, Matt, what effect did it have on the county?
Well, the county itself started its true period of awakening and coming into a much more modern era. Through the rest of the 1800s, what happened, you had more roads, even though the railroad didn't expand at this time. You had more roads headed up towards the mountains, opening up Blowing Rock, opening up Boone. Even as late as 2 or 3 decades later, someone remarked the only way to get to Boone is to be born there.
Okay.
So and then you also start seeing a harvesting of timber. Still small scale, but this continued through the 1800s or through the 1880s. Then in 1891, the presence of the Chester-Lenoir narrow gauge spurs another railroad. This railroad is called the Lower Creek and Linville Valley Transportation Company. Mm-hmm. A year later, it's reorganized and becomes the Caldwell and Northern. It too is built as a narrow gauge railroad, not near to the standards of the Chester and Lenoir, because it was eventually just going to be a temporary railroad, and it was built 10 miles from the end of the railroad in Lenoir to Collettsville. And the timber started going that way. In 1894, the railroad that leased the Chester and Lenore narrow gauge and completed it, went into bankruptcy with several other railroads throughout the South. That railroad was reorganized as the Southern Railway.
Okay.
A couple years later, and at the time when it was reorganized as the Southern Railway, George Harper of Lenore became the president of the Chester and Lenore narrow gauge. They were given the opportunity to join the Southern Railway, and they declined. They said, we're going to operate this as our own railroad. Well, that was okay for a couple years, but George Harper did a magnificent job. 2 years later, Southern Railway wanted the Chester and Lenore. You've heard of robber barons.
Yes.
And tactics like that which were less than ethical. The Southern Railway, using robber baron techniques, basically had one of its shareholders sue the Chester and Lenore narrow gauge on its behalf over an old bond issue. The courts ruled in favor of the Southern Railway, and the railroad was reorganized as the Carolina and Northwestern. It was still a narrow gauge at this time, but at that time the ownership passed from a locally owned company into a wholly owned company of the Southern Railway.
Okay.
Now, what did this do? For a few years, nothing. There was quite a bit of animosity actually between the Chester and Lenore and the Southern Railway. There was actually a riot in Hickory between the two railroads, and they had to call out 100 officers where the railroad splits off to come to Lenore. In 1902, however, the Southern Railway, they allowed the Carolina and Northwestern to go from a narrow gauge railroad to a standard gauge railroad. Now, why is that important? Well, today, if you load a carload of something in Lenore, you can ship it to California, and it stays in that same carload. In the narrow gauge days, you could go as far as the standard gauge railroad, then you had to unload everything from the narrow gauge car into the standard gauge car. That's called transloading.
Right.
Added a lot of time, which added a lot of costs. So in 1902, the Carolina and Northwestern became a standard gauge railroad, and that was just as big as the narrow gauge coming into town.
How did they transition, Matt? Did they just add another rail, or did they have to start all over with their rails? Or?
It took several years. What they ended up doing was replacing the cross ties several years before it happened with shorter cross ties with longer cross ties. And then they did a section of railroad at a time. The Hickory to Lenore was one of the first sections done. The original section of the railroad from Chester to York, South Carolina, was the last section done.
Okay.
And yes, what they did is they just added another rail to the outside. And of course, they had to buy all new equipment. The narrow gauge equipment was completely obsolete at that time.
I see.
So it was an expensive proposition, but it was well worth the money.
Okay, now the George Harper you mentioned a few minutes ago, is that GWF Harper?
Yes, it is.
Oh, okay. The major, I know
Absolutely.
him more by initials
Major
than I do
Harper.
by his name.
It was Major Harper. Yes.
Right.
Now, also 1902 was important because the Carolina and Northwestern purchased the Caldwell and Northern, the narrow gauge logging railroad. And at that time, they began an expansion into Wilson's Creek. The intent at the time was to build up through Wilson's Creek, tunnel through the Grandfather Ridge, and follow the Watauga River into Tennessee.
That'd have been quite an undertaking, wouldn't it?
It absolutely was, but at the time, on paper, the route looked magnificent because the Clinchfield Railroad hadn't been built, and it would have been the shortest route across the Blue Ridge Mountains to the coal fields of Kentucky. Now, this effort went on for more than a decade, and the Carolina and Northwestern, with its initials C&NW, became ridiculed for never having the ability to do it.
The can't and never
And
will.
it was called the Can't and Never Will.
So I do remember a few things you tell me. I remember the can't and never will part.
Absolutely.
Okay, we do have some pictures here that show how it moved on up into that area through Collettsville, on up into Wilson's Creek.
Well, these pictures are great, and some background to these pictures are you had by 1905 the railroad, the East Tennessee and Western North Carolina, the original Tweetsie Railroad. It had a spur of another railroad called the Linville River, and it was operating a sawmill at Pinola in the early 1900s. That sawmill was operated by William Ritter, the Ritter Lumber Company, which was by far the largest timbering concern in the Southeast. He was very good friends with the new president of the Carolina and Northwestern, who was William Barber, former Attorney General for South Carolina. The plan was for the Carolina and Northwestern to extend the Caldwell and Northern Railroad from Collettsville up through Wilson's Creek Gorge. At the same time, Ritter would build down from Pinola, and the two railroads would meet. And they met at the new towns to be Mortimer and Edgemont.
Okay.
That construction started taking place in 1903. It was not completed until early 1905. These are some magnificent shots of the area. Wilson's Creek, of course, is just a rugged, magnificent, and largely unspoiled preserve.
Still that way,
It's
isn't it?
unbelievable. It is a national treasure, and I kind of regret telling people this on TV because if everybody wants to go there, it might be not quite so unspoiled, but everyone should go there. Basically, the Caldwell and Northern followed Highway 90, went through Setzer's Gap, followed Highway 90 out to Collettsville, and then if it takes a very hard left out towards Brown Mountain Beach, and was built up gradually on the ridge that parallels the road to this day. This second picture reflects the Attico Trestle. A lot of people around here tell you that was the highest trestle east of the Mississippi. No, it wasn't. It was a substantial trestle nonetheless, but it was nowhere near one of the highest trestles. Again, this is off an old stereo view. This is an old locomotive of off the Richmond and Danville, which became Southern Railway, coming over the Attico Trestle, and of course the Wilson's Creek. This Collettsville was the last major town between Lenoir and Edgemont and Mortimer, and these photographs are absolutely magnificent of a depot and depot life. And the road to this day, once you get to Brown Mountain Beach and head towards Mortimer and Edgemont, most of the gravel road to this day that you drive up there is on top of the old railroad roadbed. So you can go through some of these cuts, and you can imagine yourself on a locomotive or a train and going through these.
The interior view of the Collettsville station area is rather unusual. You seldom saw interior views at this time period.
That's true. Well, you had to worry about the exposure. The cameras were a lot harder to work with.
Have you idea who those two gentlemen are?
Actually, offhand, I do not. I'm sure we could go back 1905 and find out who the station agent was there and their assistant.
But yeah, I think we're very fortunate to have those pictures too, and I agree with you. I think they're magnificent, and they show, as we said, something that you don't always see in photographs from that time period.
Right.
Okay, and then we moved on up toward Wilson's Creek, Mortimer area, and our next section of pictures, I believe, kind of documents some of that.
Right. The development of Wilson Creek and the Mortimer area had as much to do with the rise of Lenoir as the furniture capital of the world, and for that matter, Hickory, as anything else. Because what you ended up with was the raw timber coming out of the mountains to the sawmill at Mortimer, which opened in 1905 and lasted for a couple of decades. That timber was brought to Lenoir and made into furniture. Then it went to Hickory and went out on the Southern Railway. Essentially, the Carolina Northwestern was a furniture railroad on this upper half, And on the southern half, from Newton south, was more of a textile railroad. But the development of Mortimer and Edgemont and all of those timber resources did more to develop this town and the industrial base it even has to this day, even though it's suffering a little bit today. It did more to influence the 20th century than anything else, by far.
And we don't always think of that.
Absolutely. Well, if you accept the value, the face value of 5,000 people showed up at the driving of the last spike of the Chester and Lenore, Mortimer almost overnight went from 0 to just under 1,000 people. It's 20% population growth in the county, just in the blink of an eye.
Yeah, the story of the growth of Mortimer is a very interesting one, and of course we've got to thank our friend Sandra Coffey for preserving so much of that Mortimer history too. That seems to be her little area of interest, and so when I want to know something about railroads, I call you, but if I want to know something about Mortimer, I call Sandra.
She's the expert, absolutely.
She is. What about the other pictures there?
Well, these are very interesting pictures, particularly the first couple of columns of pictures in the area of Mortimer and Edgemont. It showed a little bit of the life. Now, even though by this time the Carolina and Northwestern and the Caldwell and Northern were standard gauged, the railroad, the lumber mills operated their own railroads up there. Those were narrow gauge railroads. Now, those had some specialized locomotives, like this old Shea this old Heisler locomotive actually, that could go steep grades. They weren't good for pulling freight trains and passenger trains because they only go 10 miles an hour tops. But they were like Jeeps.
Right.
They could, where another locomotive would slide going up a steep hill, they could climb right up it and pull wooden loaded cars with
Right.
timber on it. This is a close-up of Mortimer. Actually, this track follows the road to this day. The depot, which of course none of this exists now, but to this day you come around a curve and where you can see where the Mortimer depot was. Most of the Mortimer depot still exists at Tweetsy.
Oh, okay.
It lasted until the 60s, and it was torn down and transported to Tweetsy and rebuilt. This is the last train from Edgemont, past the railroad essentially after all the area had been timbered out, and an effort was made at a cotton mill up there. It didn't pan out. The railroad abandoned the line from Edgemont and Mortimer to basically Valmead in 1938.
Okay. There was, at one time, wasn't Edgemont, again, a tourist destination? People would go up.
Mortimer was the industrial town. Edgemont was the tourist town. And it was actually started and owned by the railroad. A lot of people locally will tell you about the legendary Edgemont Hotel,
Right.
the Dodge House, Granny Seahorn. That was actually started by the railroad. The Edgemont Company was a corporation owned by the Carolina and Northwestern. And it was developed entirely for the tourists. And it was very popular.
Very good, But then it was cut off, I guess, when the trains quit going up there. That probably cut off a lot of the people from going there.
Absolutely. Well, even particularly 10 years ago, if you drive up in the area, you would see that the area still hasn't recovered from losing the railroad.
Right.
While it's still wild and undeveloped, that's the plus side.
Right.
The negative side is you see very few businesses to this day
Right.
along the road between Valmead and Edgemont.
Right. Those people come to Lenore to work. They come to Lenore to shop.
That's right. It is still an isolated area.
Still an isolated area, but again, as you say, a very nice area.
Absolutely. Some more pictures, just station life, station master at Edgemont. Here you have Edgemont Depot, and you have 3 rails, question mark. What in the world is that? You probably asked yourself. Well, this was the end of the line. This is a passenger train. It was standard gauge Carolina and Northwestern. There were so many logging trains between the Ritter Lumber Company and Hutton Bourbonnais that the railroad allowed these logging companies to lay a 3rd rail between their tracks so narrow gauge trains could run on the same tracks.
Okay.
It was good for everybody's
Sure.
business. So that's why you have 3 rails.
I assumed it was some reason like that. That was the only logical thing I could think of that it would be for.
Right.
Okay, then looks like that everything didn't always go too smoothly with railroads. There were derailments, there were wrecks, there were other things.
Well, you have car derailment in Wilson Creek. And where this is really interesting is, yes, it's derailed, but it's a stock car. And this is actually off a stereo view, and these are convicts.
Okay.
And you notice that they're all black. During Reconstruction, North Carolina allowed its penitentiary inmates to be rented out to railroads. It basically was little more than sanctioned slavery.
Right.
Because they were rented out, and by and large, they were all black.
And the penitentiary had been segregated in those days, too.
That's right, that's right. Several convicts lost their lives building the railroads up through here, and actually the practice lasted until 1917.
Right.
But, you know, they say, well, were they treated humanely? Well, they were hauled in a stock car.
Oh, my goodness.
So this particular car is a stock car that was made for cattle.
Okay, but,
So this
but
is
was
an
transporting
interesting.
convicts.
That's right. I mean, this photograph is interesting just from a social standpoint.
Right. Okay, and then the other train wrecks, can you comment on those in any way?
Well, absolutely. Basically, real quick, through the teens and 20s, the Mortimer and Edgemont area were timbered out.
Right.
An effort was made at a cotton mill, as I mentioned, and it went nowhere. In 1938, the railroad was abandoned from Lenoir to Edgemont. However, the good news was, for the 4 decades previously, Lenoir's industrial base had been built up. All of the legendary furniture companies that you think of Lenoir were well established by the 30s.
Absolutely, yes.
And so you had a super industrial base in the 1930s, even with the Depression. Once you had World War II kicking in, you had the raw lumber coming up from Hickory. It was turned into bunks, into furniture, feeding the war machine.
Right.
And so it was not uncommon for 4 trains a day, freight trains, much less the daily passenger trains, to come to Lenoir. So it was very bustling. Here's an accident in 1923 of one of the locomotives. And all of this continued through the 40s. In the late 40s, you had a wreck at Hudson where a double-headed steam locomotive jumped, a rail broke on a bridge. And it actually went over and took the bridge down with it. And it killed a fireman who was from York, South Carolina.
Okay. That was a freight train, you said?
That was a freight train,
Okay.
yes. The worst passenger accident that ever happened on the Chester, Lenoir, or the Carolina Northwestern happened in 1891 when a passenger train south of Newton jumped a bridge at Smire Creek Trestle and killed 7 or 8 people, including a very prominent minister who was on his way from the Gaston Female College to take a position with what is now Lenoir Iron College.
Okay. So we've been very fortunate as far as accidents are concerned. That's bad, but it could have been a lot worse.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Look yonder coming down the railroad track. Look yonder coming down the railroad track. It's the Orange Blossom Special, bringing my baby back.
That was such a detailed and really outstanding history. What happened to the railroads?
Well, the good news is they're still here.
That's good.
As we mentioned, the industry in World War II really spurred a lot of changes, a lot of growth. The end of the war saw a lot of changes also. You had a new technology, diesel-electric locomotives. You also had modern paved roads and automobiles. In 1947, the last scheduled passenger train of the Carolina Northwestern ran from Lenoir to Chester. Lenoir very much opposed dropping the passenger train. In return for the town dropping its petition to the Interstate Commerce Commission, The railroad agreed that they would station a full-time switch engine up here. They were going to fully dieselize, which they did. They got rid of every steam locomotive in 1948, in March of 48. The Carolina Northwestern was one of the first fully dieselized railroads in the country in 1948. From 48 through the 50s and 60s, the Carolina Northwestern, eventually, through its life, had been operated as a separate railroad from the Southern Railway. It was still part of it, people knew it, but it was separate. Over the next few decades, it would slowly lose the identity. The engines and cabooses that came up didn't say Carolina Northwestern, they said Southern Railway. And just bit by bit, just like an ice cube melting, it just sort of faded away, even through the 50s, the 60s, and all the way through the 80s. Now, in the 80s, furniture traffic was still pretty good. In the Reagan years, a lot of deregulation happened between the trucking industries and the railroad industries. And furniture started leaving the rails in a wholesale manner. As a result, Southern Railway didn't think that the railroad was quite so profitable, so they leased it to another operator who didn't have the union labor, didn't have the insurance rates, so they could operate it. Into the 1990s, it was still touch and go very much, and even the short line operator couldn't make it. So the railroad was even threatened to be abandoned in the early 1990s. It was basically going to be sold for scrap value from Hickory to Lenoir for about $250,000. Now, a lot of people said, let it go. It's 2 streaks of rust. Railroads are a relic of the past century. Why should we continue? Why should we buy it? At the time, Caldwell County was even starting to face the cleanup of the chemical plant. There wasn't a lot of money. But fortunately, there was enough foresight for the county to buy the railroad. So to this day, Caldwell County owns the rails and leases it to an operator. Now, why is this important? Well, it's important because still thousands of people are served by the industries that depend on the railroad to this day, even though it may not run every day. The operators are doing very well in keeping the railroad viable. It's a lifeline for several hundred employees in several factories. If you look at the importance of a railroad, even in nearby Alexander County, it wasn't until the mid-1990s that Taylorsville even had a federal road. The county seat didn't even have a federal road, but the Alexander Railroad kept them on the map. And things are turning now with gas going at $2.50 a gallon and may go over $4 by the end of the summer. Railroads are the most fuel-efficient form of land transportation to this day. What you can haul on the railroad can go 4 times further than by a truck. So for the long hauls, the railroad is still a very, very viable means of transportation. And it's not going to go anywhere anytime soon.
You've just hit on something there that I had wondered about too with the high rising price of gas. Why has the passenger train not made a comeback? Why are we not, when we go from Lenoir to Hickory, why are we not riding the train instead of driving our cars?
Well, unfortunately in the South, we still have the mentality of we have our own cars, we're going to go. So we don't have the public transportation systems. Even if you could go get on a train in Lenoir and go to downtown Hickory, where are you going to go from there? Who's going to take you from there? So until a bus system gets out and more, plus you have the politics, liability insurance, somebody starts the train too fast and hurts their neck, who's going to sue whom? So, it's a lot more, but it is turning. Look at Charlotte, for example, spending almost $1 billion on light rail, and they're going to spend almost $1 billion to upgrade the railroad between Mooresville and Charlotte. It's coming. It's going to take several decades, but it is coming, and it won't be going anywhere.
Good. I heard you say once before, there's only so many mountains you can knock down to build an interstate highway.
That's right.
And a set of rails put down can carry a lot of people.
That's exactly right.
So hopefully we are going to see a comeback. It would be maybe a novelty, but it'd also be a necessity.
Absolutely. Well, freight-wise, freight railroads to this day are making more money than ever. So it's not that they've really gone anywhere. It's just because they don't carry the passengers.
Right.
They're not in the public's eye.
Right.
But railroading is still a very, very viable transportation to this day.
Right. We might take this time to mention, too, that Matt has written several books on railroad history. The one probably that most of this material today came from is the C&NW Railroad. Is that the name of it?
The Legacy of the Carolina Northwestern.
Legacy of the Carolina Northwestern. But he's also written some books on other railroads in the area in western North Carolina, not just in Caldwell County, but in other areas as well. And if you are interested, we have some of them here at the Caldwell Heritage Museum, and I can certainly put you in touch with Matt to order others. They also can use your website, I guess.
Absolutely. TarHillPress.com.
TarHillPress.com. Okay, and Matt, we appreciate your being here with us today. And we'd like to invite you to come visit the Caldwell Heritage Museum. We're located at 112 Vaden Street Southwest in Lenoir, right behind the Davenport A+ School. In addition to this railroad display that you've seen here, we have other things that relate to Caldwell County history as well. We're open on Tuesday through Friday from 10 till 4:30 p.m., Saturdays from 10 until 3 p.m. And so we would be glad to see you at any time you come. Thank you for watching Caldwell History Today.
I was born in Dixie in a boomer shack, just a little shanty by the railroad track. The humming of the drivers was my lullaby in a freight
County today. I'm Bill Kincaid, Caldwell County's Public Information Officer, and I'm up here on the porch at the Wilson Creek Visitor Center. And right now, I can't, as hot as it is, I can't think of a nicer place to be today. I'm joined now by I call him well-known author. He's well-known to me, Matt Bumgarner. Welcome, Matt.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Matt's up here today. This is the next to the last day of August. Matt's going to be here talking about trains of western North Carolina, or western North Carolina. He's a train buff. If you recall, we recently did a show at the Heritage Museum in Lenoir with Matt, John Hawkins, and he told us all about the community of Grandin, and it's amazing, Matt, how closely Grandin almost paralleled Mortimer.
Absolutely. Mortimer was the granddaddy of it all, though. Unlike Grandin, which failed, Mortimer was pretty much a spectacular success. It had 15 years of unparalleled success, really, in the county, and it was responsible for Lenoir becoming the furniture capital of the world, particularly in the early part of the century.
Matt, we ran out of time the other day, but I've wondered ever since we did the interview if William Grandin had started in 1901, 1902, or 1903 as William Mortimer did, would it have made a difference, do you think? Because the flood, Grandin just got set up, and the 1916 flood came. Do you think he could have made it big as Mortimer did?
I think he certainly could have. The other thing that Grandin had against him was the outbreak of World War I in Europe, which plunged the economy into recession. When Mortimer and Edgemont were being built at the end of the 90s and into the tens and teens, the American economy was really growing at an unparalleled rate. So, like in real estate where location is everything, in business it's a lot to do with timing. And Grandin was 15 years too late.
So you think if he had been, of course he was in, and I've, for those who watched the show, there was a Grandin, Missouri, in addition to Grandin, North Carolina, in Missouri this week, and I asked him if he'd been out hunting Grandin, Missouri.
Yeah, basically there's not much left there either. But in its day, it was every bit as prosperous, more so even, than Mortimer and Edgemont. So, you know, on paper, William Grandin knew how to do it. He knew how to get things done. He was experienced, and he had the money behind him. But the timing, history, and Mother Nature all conspired against him.
Actually, by the time the 1916 flood came, Ritter Lumber had pretty well cleaned out what they had come for, hadn't they, here?
Yes, they had. The timbering in this part of the county really started in 1892. You had it was called the Pole Road, the Lower Creek and Linville River Transportation Company. It was quickly reformed a few years later as the Caldwell and Northern, and by the late 1890s had been built from Lenoir to Collettsville. By 1902, the Carolina and Northwestern purchased a controlling interest and extended basically it was a narrow gauge railroad from Collettsville to Lenoir. The Carolina and Northwestern bought it, and what they did, the president of the Carolina and Northwestern was William Barber. He was the Attorney General of South Carolina. He was very good friends with William Ritter, who owned a logging railroad, the Linville River Railway, which basically ran from Cranberry to Pinola, up on top of the mountain above us. Those two decided to
Just in the next county.
just right over the next county on top of the mountain. Those two friends decided that basically Ritter had timbered out the Pinola area. He would build down into Wilson Creek, and William Barber would extend the Caldwell and Northern, the Carolina and Northwestern, from Collettsville on up into basically what was Mortimer today. So they each built halfway and met here in the middle.
I wish they hadn't. They took the track out here, much like they did in Grandin, at the beginning of World War II there. But can you imagine? I'm always thinking tourism, and I think of the Smoky Mountain Railroad. Can you imagine a railroad trip from, say, Hickory to Edgemont on a Sunday afternoon or Saturday afternoon junket? I mean, can you imagine? They did that 100 years ago.
Absolutely. I still, to this day, hold that Wilson Creek is Western North Carolina's best kept secret.
Well, it was about impossible to get in here, and I'll admit this road. I mean, it's a good road for me. I mean, if you come up here a few times, you don't notice any difference. But if you're from out of town, it can be boogery looking.
Absolutely. Other than the tourist line, for those that watched our program on Grandin, part of his plan was to build his railroad on across from Grandin across to Tennessee. What a lot of people don't realize is that the railroad actually did exist at one point between Mortimer. There was a logging link via the Ritter line up to Pinola, and then you had what became the Tweetsie Railroad, which ran from Pinola to Cranberry to Tennessee. It almost happened. I mean, from a scenic standpoint, you're right, but really from an economic standpoint, Western North Carolina was connected to Eastern Tennessee. The problem is it was just so steep between Mortimer and the top of the mountain at Pinola that it just couldn't economically, you couldn't run a train economically and make money.
I have a railroad question. In your book about Grandin, you said that they were wanting to build the train up from Darby on in, and what was the steepest grade they were wanting? 3%. 3%. How do you build a railroad from here to Boone and no steeper than 3%?
Well, there was some extensive tunneling that would have been needed. That really was the real bugbear. The original estimates that said, okay, we're going to go get the bonds, we're going to build, which said it was viable, were, of course, way off. And later estimates said, no, we're going to need a tunnel, maybe two, to get to Boone. And, of course, that never happened. The same way, the Carolina Northwestern, which built here in the Edgemont, was called the Can't and Never Will, because they kept saying, well, we're going to extend to Tennessee. And eventually, nope, CNNW's Can't and Never Will. And likewise, a lot of tunneling was required, particularly as you extend from Mortimer Edgemont area up through the Grandfather Ridge, the Blowing Rock Ridge. If my memory's correct, almost 2,500 feet of tunneling would have been required through solid granite. And a little railroad like CNNW just couldn't afford it.
What, and I know I'm not a railroad buff, you are, what's the steepest grade a railroad can reasonably travel over?
Well, the steepest mainline grade in the United States is Saluda, and that's between Spartanburg, South Carolina, and Asheville, North Carolina, and that's 4%. Well, you think 4%, I mean, that, if you're sitting there looking at it, it almost looks straight up. The 4% is steep. Now, logging railroad,
3% would have been almost as steep.
that's right. The logging railroad, which ran in this part of the country, you had special locomotives called Heislers and Shays. Relating to automobiles are kind of like Jeeps. Well, they could climb almost a 10% grade. They were geared engines rather than rods, like you might, when somebody thinks of a steam locomotive and the rods and the big wheels driving side to side. The Shays were actually geared. They couldn't go very fast. They couldn't go more than, say, 10 miles an hour, but they could climb a telephone pole if they had to.
Matt, let's play prognosticator. Maybe that's not the right word. We talked the other day about if Grandin hadn't washed out and all this because of the location. Okay, let's say the 16 flood didn't hit here and then the 40 flood didn't hit here. What would have happened in Mortimer and Edgemont?
I think the timber would have died anyway. 1916, it didn't do much for the people, but as far as Ritter was concerned, it just cleaned up the mess he left behind. After he logged for almost 15 years. Some logging had been also in the works 10 years previous to that. So after 25 total years of lumbering in an era when timber was not viewed as a renewable resource, so that means there's no replanting, this area would have been logged out. However, you also had the cotton mill here in Mortimer. That was essentially it was never highly successful. If it could, I think really the only hope would have been for the railroad to extend permanently, and the railroad had been upgraded to Tennessee and become a through freight. There just hasn't been a lot of industry. On the flip side, though, as you drive up the road from Lenoir and you see the areas between Collettsville and some of the other areas, it's still wild. Some areas you might say are poverty. That just goes to show you what happens when the railroad pulled out. That was the only chance this railroad that this area had. And fortunately, like the railroad which still exists in Lenoir, which was saved, it was in danger of being abandoned a few years ago. That gave Lenoir and kept Lenoir with its ability to have that economic viability into the future. So I really don't know. An industry could have come in here, maybe gotten some tax breaks, maybe gone into the cotton mill, which was wiped out by the 40 flood, and around that nucleus, more industry could have sprung up.
Do you think? My theory is that, and O.P. Lutz was ready to open, and we've interviewed people who worked, and he spent a lot of money and brought in brand new state-of-the-art equipment for 1940, and then here came the flood and just wiped him out. But would that have been would other people have set up plants? I doubt that other plants would have come.
It's hard to say. You have a lot of water power up here, but by that time you have the coal boilers and electricity, so water power it's just so far out of the way. That's why I think the railroad, for this area to had a real chance at industrial success, the railroad would have had to kept moving into Tennessee and becoming a tremendously successful bridge route. It really could have been, had they overcome the steepness of the grades and the tunneling. On the flip side, had it become industrialized, you wouldn't have the beautiful area it is today.
That's what I was just sitting here thinking. We went with some corporate office might be in here where the visitor center is today.
Well, absolutely, and you have Ripshin Ridge and Chestnut Mountain knocked down, and who knows what there is. And I was sitting there thinking as I'm driving up and bumping along on the dirt road, I really, truly hope that this road out here is never paved. I would hate for this to become another Great Smoky Mountains Park where pollution is the greatest fear, and you end up with traffic jams between here and Brown Mountain Beach. It's just, it's right now it's still rugged enough where you are out in the wild, but it's still accessible.
Well, it's lovely up here. I could just sit here and rock and swing. We've got a nice swing over here and all these rocking chairs, and we got some. I don't know if you've been able to hear from the background noise. We've had some nice people coming in and out. And the ladies are out at the picnic shelter fixing us a meal, I believe, or I hope I say us, I hope we're invited. But Matt, I want to thank you for this interview, and you know, we don't know what this area would have been. I'm inclined to think it would have, even for Railroad State, it would have been pretty well a tourist area, or like it, or hunting and fishing. I don't see it ever becoming the industrial. Now, there was great thoughts back in, especially after the 40 flood. People, I found newspaper stories where they'd say, "Oh, if we could have a plant up here, and we want the mill reopened, we want this." I mean, we got the worker. They said there's hundreds of people on these hills who come out to work every day.
That's true. Well, you got to remember the Lenore paper said Mortimer grew up overnight and flourished like the Green Bay tree. You had 800 workers here, just in the mill alone, not to mention those that were in the forest cutting down the trees. So when the mill's gone, well, of course, they're begging for a plant to come up here. You had a workforce ready, but you just didn't have the industrial base.
I think it's interesting, Matt, in looking back, they had electricity, they had telephone service, they had running water, they had a boardwalk. Of course, it was more for the upper management group, the guys that cut the timber. They didn't have a boardwalk, but it was really a well-developed town. It had town government. They had Bill Mortimer, for whom the town was named, was the first mayor. We have pictures of him on the wall in here. He ran the general store, and I've often thought we in Ritter must have trusted Mortimer to let him name the town after him instead of, it could have been Ritter, North Carolina, instead of Mortimer.
Absolutely. It absolutely could have been. And, you know, it is like, you know, these are not the days anymore when somebody goes and works for a company for 50 years. That's rare now. But back then, that was a time when your company was also your family. And Ritter had a logging empire that stretched across the southeast. So, of course, you can't micromanage that. I'm sure he had, just like Ritter or Mortimer in this area, he had other managers in West Virginia and Georgia and Tennessee. And
Should have worked for him. It may have been a Bumgarner, West Virginia or something, Matt.
well, I don't know, but I don't think I'd let a Bumgarner handle the money.
Well, Matt, I believe we've got some folks coming in here, and you're not here to talk to me. You're here to talk to folks who want to know more about Wilson Creek and Mortimer and trains. Thanks so much, Matt.
Thanks. I'm ready to get one of those hamburgers.